Hi, I'm Alex, and this is gonna be my first research and development video. So I'm just gonna go over what I did and how we started. So we're using Unity to make a game, and we found this map template from YouTube, which automatically generates a random map every time based off Slay the Spire. So look, if we generate, it makes a new map with new points. And we just found this on YouTube. I'll probably link it on my ePortfolio if you would like to use it. But so far, I've been working on were enemy stages. So when you click on an enemy stage, you get teleported, and an army of enemies spawns. Right now, it's a little buggy, and enemies are invisible sometimes, but I'm gonna work on fixing that. We're gonna go back to the enemy stage now because this is where I've been working on the most. When you press, when the scene loads, it's supposed to spawn in enemies, as you can see here, but a lot of them are invisible. And when you kill them, new ones are spawned. And then we have a sword which you can swing. And as you can see, when you move, the background moves. The clouds move faster than the back. So what I worked on first was character movement. I used most of it from my old script, but as we can go here into my player script, we can see that it's just movement with a sprite transform for like my movement, and it's mostly just if you press a button, it's going to move in that direction. But then I have these mouse positions, and it calculates your mouse position, and this is for flipping the character, because when we go back, as you can see, when I move my mouse, the sprite moves. So that's what this mouse position and direction is for, and then this flipping script right here. This just rotates my character to make sure everything looks nice. Next are my enemies. Here is just the basic enemy. As you can see, it's just a sprite renderer with a hitbox. And we can go into the script to see that there's a second one, what I used as a trigger. The reason why I did this is because the enemies would get stuck on the player but not deal damage. But this way, I made it that enemies in the enemy layer in tag can't go through the player. They can't collide with player tag. And as we can see here, the player has that player tag, so the enemy can't. But this box glider here, what's a trigger, can. So if it hits the player, it's gonna run the enemy damage script, which is right here, which literally is just saves the damage, figures out where the player health script is, and it interacts with the enemy movement for a retreat script, but I'll show you. So it automatically finds the player and the player health, and figures out where its enemy movement is. And then, as you can see, it figures out the box collider. It forces it to be a trigger if it isn't. And then, when you have a trigger, it's going to check if it's out as a player, and then it's going to run the take damage script and the enemy retreat script. So now we can go to the player again to see the player's health. Player health right here is, you can set the health, and since it's public, once I have like an upgrade system, you'll be able to increase your health. It's going to automatically keep track of your health. And then it has a health bar script, which I can show you again 1 second, but as you can see, it always makes sure the health is correct. I have a little space bar test to see if it takes damage, and then on damage, it will run the damage script, and then it will update the health bar. And if once you hit 0, it just heals you to full, because this is testing. But if we go back into the game, you can see once an enemy hits me, my health goes down, And there's a gradient too, as you can see. So 40, it turned yellow. 30. Here and I can see red. And then, yep. And now we can go into weapons. As you can see on the player, I have two parents, this sword parent and this range parent. If I enable it, you can just see it's a sword and a bow. Both of them use this weapon parent script what I have, which basically is where all the attack and firing is. So it figures out what your sprite is, because as you can see, the sword parent has a sword, and it has this blue dot. This is where the projectile spawns, which for the sword is the slash. And then you can see this the sprite and the location where it spawns. The weapon parent just figures out what your cooldown is, which you can manually set here, the time between firing. And it tells it where to spawn the projectile. And yeah, when you move your mouse, it's like the character where it will flip, but it also rotates around the player, so you can aim at your mouse. And then the slash attack, it just spawns a prefab. This prefab slash attack, it just has a capsule collider for the hitbox, a sprite, and then it goes through this a little complicated slash attack sprite. Basically, you can set its damage. This facing right is just for a rotation for when you move it around so it looks good. This lifetime is how long the projectile lasts before it despawns. And then the player projectile location. And then this collider list is for hit enemies, because I wanted the script to only hit every unique enemy once, so you can't just hit the same enemy like 4 times with the same attack. As you can see in the start, it just figures out where the right place is, and then the reason why it's in, and then it figures where your mouse is, the rotation it should be, and the rotation of the projectile, and then it's gonna go into this destroy game object lifetime. So basically, the lifetime is how long the projectile lasts, and then the game object is the slash attack. This is the initial spawn, so when you swing your sword once, it's going to run through this. But then we go here. This right here updates the projectile, so when you rotate your sword, it's going to keep following the sword instead of just staying in one place. And then this on destroy just makes sure no errors happen, because I used to have an error where it would, when you delete it, it would still try to see if it was there with the update, and then it would just break. And then here's the enemy thing. It will figure out if the tag it hit was an enemy, and then if it already is in the list, if it isn't in the list, it's going to add it to the list and then deal damage and make the enemy take damage. And the enemy is basically the same as the player. So now we can go into the enemy movement, because that's pretty interesting. Right now, it's just a chaser AI. So it's going to chase the player, jump randomly, and try to deal damage. All of these variables are like the enemy type, so you can change the AI type once we get there. And then all of these are chaser stats, and then like the rigid body and stuff for health and stuff. So on start, what it's going to do is it's going to figure out if there's a player, and then it's going to target the player's location. And then this rigid body stuff is just to get all the scripts it needs. And then this void update is basically just, if the enemy is this AI, run this script. I did it like this because it's far less messy, because here, as you can see, we can just compact all of these other voids. So this is a chaser AI, so if it's retreating, it's not going to run through the script at all. and then it's gonna calculate the distance from the player. This was originally stolen from not stolen. I repurposed it from a platformer game where the enemy would only chase if you're a certain distance from the player. And then it's gonna figure out which direction it has to go, the speed it has to go, and then it's gonna move towards the player. If it's not retreating, this is literally just the movement script basically, so it's gonna move in that direction. This is just the rotation if it's looking left or right, depending on the player. This is a script where it slows down the enemy once it gets close enough so it doesn't overshoot the player. And that leads to like a jump attack kinda. And then here is just the random jump, so if the time, whatever I set it to, is greater than a jump timer, which is the cooldown, and then make sure it's grounded. And then this random variable is, every frame it's gonna roll, and if you get and I set it to 20%, so there's a 20% chance every frame that it's gonna jump, or, no, 2%, sorry. And then it's gonna jump and reset the cooldown. This is just the raycast to make sure it's touching the ground. If it's touching the ground, it can jump. If it's not touching the ground, it can't jump. This is the retreating script, so if it hits the player through enemy damage, see it calls this retreat. It makes the enemy immune to taking attacks from the player, so the player can't get free damage by just dealing damage, and then it's going to run through the retreat. So the retreat stops, as you can see, retreat true, and over here, remember, if retreating, it's not going to be able to chase the player, so it stops movement. So it's going to figure out where the player is, and it's going to jump backwards based on the direction. And then this shoots it upwards a little for that upwards. So this is like left and right jump, and then this is just the up and down jump, and then it stops the retreat after a certain amount of time, so it doesn't just immediately start moving towards that player again and canceling out that. The stop retreat just makes it stop being immune, and it stops retreating. In this damage, I basically repurposed my retreating script, so when the enemy takes damage, it's going to get knocked back a set distance, and then it's going to take knockback based on how much percent of the health it took. So if it only took 1 damage, it's only going to take the base, but if it took 99% of its health, it's going to be flung really far, and it's pretty entertaining to watch. And this just figures out where the attack came from so it can fling it in the right direction. For my background in clouds, I use a thing called parallax, where the background is desynced from the other scenes to make it add depth. This script here, you can set how much it's gonna be multiplied by. So if you want stuff in the front, it moves faster than the stuff in the back, so it adds more movement. This figures out where the camera is because it follows the camera and not the player. And then, as you can see, it just calculates where the camera is, where the camera was, what sprite it's attached to, the texture of the sprite, and the size of the sprite, because, as you can see here, my clouds are scaled to 8 times the size, and this is 2 times. And before, it would automatically just assume every scale was 1, and it would lead to very jittery teleports and stuff. So this was a bug fix I did to make sure it worked. And then this is late update because I wanted to make sure that the camera already moved before it runs this script. And then basically, it figures out where you moved and where to move the. So it looks like the background is moving slowly and you're actually moving somewhere instead of just being stuck in one place. Yep, so. And then this is my enemy spawner. Basically, it's a little buggy, as you could see, with slow enemies, invisible enemies. I'm gonna be bug fixing that, but as you can see, if I can give it the enemy prefab, which is just that, like this red enemy right here. It's gonna just clone this multiple times, and it's saved in a prefab over here. And yeah, this is the radius of where it spawns based on the player. Or it should be based on the player, unless I forgot to change that. And then the spawn delay, how long, and then this number of enemies is how many enemies are like on the screen. The enemies to spawn is like the random number between 15 and 45. Enemy spawn keeps track of how many enemies already spawned, and then this max enemies on screen is how many enemies are allowed to be on screen based on how many enemies are supposed to be spawned. And then this game object player, so it can figure out where to go. When you start the game, it just figures out how many enemies it's going to spawn, and then it's going to figure out how many enemies are allowed to be on screen, and then how many to initially spawn. So the max enemies of screen are 1/3 of all the enemies, and then the initial enemies to spawn is just 20%. So yeah, and then it just spawns the enemies until it runs out. And then if it already spawned enemies, it's gonna go down, spawn an enemy, and reduce. And this is a debug log because I was having issues where it wouldn't count the enemies, and when they died, and this just helped me figure out what the issue was. And then this is what spawns the enemy. So if the enemy spawned is equal to the max enemies, it's not gonna do anything. But otherwise, it's gonna figure out a random place to spawn them, and then this instantiate is going to spawn the enemy at the position. And then if that new enemy they just spawned doesn't exist, it's going to return the script, because otherwise it's going to error once you kill it. And then it's going to add one to the enemy spawn so it can keep track. Here is just figure out where to spawn. And I don't remember where I got this on Validate from, but it's probably to fix bugs, because this script was extremely buggy and had to go through numerous renditions just to get it to work like it is. Oh, I forgot to talk about the bow. The bow, if we go back to the player, functions exactly like the sword, where it uses the weapon parent with exact same scripts. But instead of a slash attack, it uses this arrow prefab, which is a sprite with the capsule collider. But it follows this ranged attack, so initially it's the same exact thing as the weapon script, but instead of following where the player goes, it's just gonna fire in one direction and then just be independent of the player, so it can go wherever. Like you shoot up, it's gonna follow that upwards path, but it follows gravity. And in this update, basically, it just figures out the rotation, so it looks like the arrow is actually following the gravity in the curve. So yeah, but basically all of this script is exactly the same as the slash script. I believe that's all there is for now, and I'll update you next week on what else I've added to this game. Bye.